Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be talking about the Emancipation Proclamation.
It's a document, that most people think they know, but there are so many layers to it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems straightforward enough on the surface, right?
Yeah.
But when you start digging into the context, the political maneuvering,
hmm
Lincoln's own evolving views on slavery.
Exactly. Like he didn't just start out as this staunch abolitionist ready to, end slavery at any cost.
Right. And you see that so clearly in his first inaugural address.
Oh, absolutely. He's practically bending over backward to assure the Southern states that he has no intention of interfering with slavery where it exists.
He's all about preserving the Union, even if it means, well, accommodating slavery, at least for the time being.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that back then there was a real question about whether the president even had the authority to abolish slavery.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the Constitution, as it stood then, protected slavery in the states where it was already legal.
Right. So Lincoln was walking this tightrope. He's personally opposed to slavery, but also believes he's bound by the Constitution. Then the war breaks out.
And everything changes.
Right. The war just throws all these new challenges at him. And one of the biggest is the issue of runaway slaves.
You have these enslaved people risking everything to escape to freedom, often fleeing to Union Army camps.
And this creates this whole legal and moral dilemma. What do you do with these people? Are they still considered property?
And this is where General Benjamin Butler comes in with his rather clever contraband of war argument.
Butler, he was a pretty sharp guy. He realizes that legally slaves are considered property. So he says, well, if they're property and they're being used to support the enemy's war effort,
Then they can be seized as contraband, just like weapons or ammunition.
bingo. It was a brilliant legal maneuver that gave Lincoln a way to start chipping away at slavery without directly challenging the Constitution.
It's amazing how this kind of legal loophole, I guess you could call it, had such a profound impact. But even with this new tool at his disposal, Lincoln was still facing a deeply divided nation.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the North was hardly unified on the issue of slavery. You had the abolitionists, of course, who were demanding immediate emancipation.
They saw the war as an opportunity to finally rid the nation of this moral stain.
Right. But then you had the moderates, who were more focused on preserving the Union, even if it meant, tolerating slavery for a bit longer.
And then, and this is hard to wrap your head around today, but there were actually some Northerners who had pro-slavery sympathies.
It's wild, right? But some folks were tied to the South economically, through trade or whatever, and of course you had plain old racism.
So Lincoln's got this incredible balancing act going on. He's trying to hold the Union together while also dealing with these wildly different views on slavery. And then you have the Copperheads.
Oh, the Copperheads, they were a real thorn in Lincoln's side.
This was the faction of the Democratic Party that opposed the war.
All right. Yeah, they were the peace at any price crowd. They argued that the war was unwinnable and that the best course of action was to negotiate a settlement with the Confederacy, even if it meant preserving slavery.
They were willing to sacrifice the moral high ground, the very principle the Union was supposedly fighting for, just to end the bloodshed.
Exactly. They saw the abolitionists as fanatics and Lincoln as a tyrant who was dragging the nation into a needless and destructive conflict.
So you've got pressure from all sides. Abolitionists are demanding immediate emancipation, moderates are urging caution, and the Copperheads are calling for surrender. What does Lincoln do?
Well, he doesn't buckle under the pressure, that's for sure, but he also doesn't go all in on immediate emancipation right away. Instead, he takes a more calculated approach. He starts by trying to nudge the border states towards gradual compensated emancipation.
This is his famous Delaware plan, right? Offering federal funds to slave owners in exchange for freeing their slaves.
Right. It was a way to try and incentivize emancipation without completely alienating these crucial border states.
It sounds like a pretty reasonable compromise, at least on paper.
Yeah, but it went over like a lead balloon.
The border states weren't buying it.
Not one bit. They saw it as impractical, an infringement on their states' rights, and just a bad deal all around. So Lincoln's first attempt at a peaceful solution to the slavery issue falls flat.
But meanwhile, Congress is starting to take its own steps toward dismantling slavery.
Oh yeah, they're not sitting idly by.
They abolished slavery in the District of Columbia, which, symbolically at least, was a huge victory for the abolitionist movement.
Absolutely. It's a signal that the tide is turning.
And then they passed the Confiscation Acts, which are pretty radical for the time.
Oh yeah, these laws basically say that any Confederate property, including slaves, can be seized by the Union Army.
So Even if Lincoln wasn't ready to fully embrace emancipation yet, the legal groundwork was being laid by Congress.
Exactly. The pieces are starting to fall into place.
And then, of course, you have those generals who just couldn't wait for Lincoln to make up his mind.
Oh, yeah, guys like Fremont and Hunter, they were out there in their districts basically declaring slaves free on their own authority.
They were like, Lincoln, come on, man, get with the program.
Right. But Lincoln, ever the cautious lawyer, overrules them. He's all about making sure everything is done legally and properly. He doesn't want to jeopardize the war effort or the fragile unity of the nation.
So we've got Lincoln juggling all these competing pressures. He's got a war to win, a nation to hold together, and this moral dilemma staring him right in the face. And all the while, the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation is starting to take shape in his mind.
You can just imagine Lincoln calling this cabinet meeting in July of 1862.
This is the one where he actually presents the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation.
That's the one. And it's got to be tense, right? I mean, he basically starts by saying, look, guys, we need to talk about this slavery thing.
Because obviously everyone knows there are some strong feelings about this in the room.
Exactly. And he knows it's going to be a tough sell.
So what happens when he actually shows them the draft? How do they react?
Well, it's a real mix, just like you'd expect from, looking at how divided the North was as a whole.
Right, like you can't expect everyone to be on board with such a radical idea.
Definitely. So you have guys like Stanton, the Secretary of War, who are totally on board. They see it as a military necessity.
Stanton, he was one of the more vocal abolitionists in Lincoln's cabinet, wasn't he?
Oh, for sure. He'd been pushing Lincoln to take a stronger stance on slavery from the very beginning of the war.
So he must have been pretty thrilled to see this proclamation.
Absolutely. He saw it as the key to winning the war, striking at the heart of the Confederate economy and their way of life.
But not everyone felt that way, I imagine.
Nope. You also had guys like Gideon Welles, the Navy Secretary, who were much more hesitant.
What were their concerns?
Well, they worried about the consequences, What would happen if you suddenly freed millions of slaves?
I mean, it's a huge social upheaval, something the country had never seen before.
Exactly. And they also worried about alienating the border states, the ones that had stayed loyal to the Union even though they allowed slavery.
Right, those were still crucial to the war effort.
Exactly. So it was a really risky move, and not everyone was convinced it was the right one.
So you've got this split within the cabinet, reflecting the larger divisions within the North. Some see it as a moral imperative, others as a dangerous gamble. What about Lincoln? Does he waver at all?
He listens to everyone, weighs all the arguments. But ultimately, he's convinced that this is the right thing to do.
Even though it's politically risky?
Oh, it was incredibly risky. And he actually had to push back against some pretty strong opposition, even within his own party.
Like, there were people who still thought colonization was a viable solution.
Can you believe that? Like sending freed slaves to Africa or somewhere else?
It seems so backwards now, but it was a mainstream idea back then.
It was, and shockingly, Lincoln himself even flirted with the idea early on. He actually met with some black leaders and tried to sell them on colonization.
How did that go?
Not well, as you can imagine. They basically told him to get lost. They argued that America was their home and they weren't going anywhere.
It's hard to fathom that even Lincoln, who we see as this great emancipator, could have entertained such an idea.
It shows you how deeply ingrained racism was, even among those who opposed slavery.
And it also shows how important the voices of black activists and leaders were in shaping Lincoln's thinking.
Absolutely. They challenged his assumptions, forced him to see things from their perspective.
So the idea of colonization is off the table, and Lincoln is committed to the Emancipation Proclamation. But he's still got to play his cards right, politically speaking.
Oh, yeah. He doesn't want to make it look like a desperate move, a sign of weakness.
So timing is everything.
Exactly. And this is where William Seward, his Secretary of State, comes in with some crucial advice.
Seward was a pretty shrewd political operator, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, he was a master strategist. And he basically tells Lincoln, look, you can't issue this proclamation after a big Union defeat. It'll look like you're just grasping at straws.
So they need a victory, or at least something that looks like a victory, to give Lincoln the political capital he needs.
Right. And luckily for Lincoln, that opportunity comes along in September 1862 with the Battle of Antietam.
That wasn't exactly a decisive victory, but it did stop the Confederate advance.
Exactly. It was enough to turn the tide, at least for the moment, and it gave Lincoln the opening he needed.
So on September 22nd, 1862, just a few days after Antietam, Lincoln announces to his cabinet his intention to issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
And it's set to go into effect on January 1st, 1863. That gave everyone a few months to, prepare for what was coming.
So what does this proclamation actually say? What are the key elements?
Well, it's a pretty straightforward document, really. Lincoln basically declares that all slaves held in Confederate territory are and henceforward shall be free.
So it's not a gradual emancipation, it's immediate.
Right, but there's a crucial caveat. It only applies to slaves in areas that are in rebellion against the United States, not in border states or areas already under Union control.
So it's a strategic move as much as anything else.
Absolutely. Lincoln is using his war powers to strike a blow against the Confederacy, and he's doing it in a way that he believes is constitutionally sound.
He's threading the needle, trying to balance his moral convictions with his legal obligations.
And he knows this is going to have huge consequences, both for the war and for the future of the country.
Speaking of consequences, let's talk about the reaction to the Emancipation Proclamation. What happens when it finally goes into effect on January 1st, 1863?
Well, it's met with a mix of jubilation and outrage, just as you might expect.
I mean, this is a document that's going to reshape the nation, so it's bound to elicit some strong emotions.
Oh, absolutely. The Confederacy, as you can imagine, is furious. They see it as a violation of their rights, an act of tyranny.
It basically undermines their entire reason for fighting the war.
Right, their whole argument about states' rights goes out the window when you're talking about freeing people who they consider property.
So it's a huge propaganda victory for the Union.
Oh, yeah. It paints the Confederacy as the villains, the defenders of slavery, and it makes it much harder for them to get support from foreign powers, like Great Britain.
Because now, the war is explicitly about slavery. It's not just about secession or states' rights anymore.
Exactly, and that makes it a lot harder for European nations to side with the Confederacy, morally speaking.
So Lincoln's move has international implications, too. It's not just a domestic issue anymore.
Nope, the whole world is watching now.
But what about the reaction in the North? Was it universally celebrated?
Not at all. The North was still pretty divided on the issue of slavery, remember?
Right. Even though they were fighting to preserve the Union, not everyone was on board with the idea of ending slavery.
Exactly. So you still had a lot of opposition to the Emancipation Proclamation, even from people who supported the war.
I guess some people just couldn't stomach the idea of black people being equal citizens.
Sadly, that was a pretty common sentiment at the time. But you also had people who were worried about the practical consequences of emancipation.
Like, what would happen to the economy? Where would all these freed slaves go?
Those were real concerns for a lot of people. And of course, you had the Copperheads, who were still arguing for a negotiated peace with the Confederacy, even if it meant preserving slavery.
So even as the nation is taking this historic step towards freedom, there's still a lot of resistance and uncertainty.
Oh, for sure. Change is never easy, especially when it's as fundamental as this. But the Emancipation Proclamation set the wheels in motion. It was a turning point that couldn't be undone.
Okay, so we've covered the politics, the reactions, but I think what's really important to understand is the actual impact of the Emancipation Proclamation. Did it actually, change things on the ground?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's not like slavery just ended overnight on January 1st, 1863, but it set in motion some really significant changes.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, one of the biggest things was the enlistment of black soldiers in the Union Army.
Right. Before the proclamation, it was kind of a mixed bag, right? Some black men were fighting, but it wasn't officially sanctioned or anything.
Yeah, and they often faced, discrimination and prejudice within the Army itself.
But after the Emancipation Proclamation, it becomes official policy.
Exactly, and you see this massive influx of black men, eager to fight for their own freedom, for their families, for their country.
I mean, that must have been incredibly powerful, both symbolically and strategically.
Oh yeah, it completely changed the dynamic of the war. Imagine being a Confederate soldier, seeing these men you've always been told were inferior, now taking up arms against you.
It must have been pretty demoralizing.
For sure. It really undermined the Confederacy's morale and made it harder for them to justify their cause to the world.
Because now it's clear that the war is about slavery, not just states' rights or whatever else they were claiming.
Right. The Emancipation Proclamation really exposes the truth of what the Confederacy is fighting for, and that makes it a lot tougher for them to get support from European countries.
So this one document, issued by Lincoln, is having ripple effects across the globe.
Absolutely, and it's giving a huge boost to the abolitionist movement worldwide. People are looking at America and saying, hey, if they can do it, maybe we can too.
It's like this moral beacon shining a light on the injustice of slavery everywhere.
And, back home in the U.S., the Emancipation Proclamation really fuels the debate about what the future of race relations is going to look like.
Because it's not like the proclamation solves everything, right? There's still a long way to go in terms of achieving true
Oh,
equality.
yeah, yeah. It's just the beginning. But it's a crucial step. It sets the stage for the 13th Amendment, which officially abolishes slavery, and for all the other legal and social changes that come after the war.
And we know that the struggle for civil rights continues to this day.
It does, unfortunately. But we can't forget how far we've come. And the Emancipation Proclamation was a huge part of that progress.
It really is remarkable. This one document, issued in the midst of a brutal war, has had such a lasting impact on the course of history.
It shows the power of leadership, the importance of moral conviction, and ultimately, the resilience of the human spirit in its pursuit of freedom.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us today for this deep dive into the Emancipation Proclamation. I hope everyone listening learned something new.
I hope so too.
And if you want to explore this topic further, we've got some great resources in the show notes. Make sure to check those out. And as always, thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating exploration of history, science, or culture. Until then, take care.